Hello and welcome. Let's jump in straight to the important happenings in the MMA world. The UFC faces setbacks in their class action lawsuit case. Dan Hooker is out with an injury and Bobby Greene needs a new opponent. It might be time to have a serious talk about Tony Ferguson. The PFL sounds like they want to book Cyborg in 2 fights next year, but Cyborg sounds like she has other plans. ONE FC is set to put on the most events they've ever held in a calendar year. Or they could just go under. Isn't MMA fun? The UFC lost 2 big motions in their bid to try to stop a class action lawsuit that they have been facing over the last few years. The UFC initially asked the judge if he can reopen discovery, which would have meant that they would start the fact-finding process all over again, or at least partially, which have added a year or maybe even more to the case as they opened up everything and looked at everything. At the same time, they're preparing a summary judgment motion, which should have asked the judge if he could rule on certain parts of the case, meaning his scope would be limited and the things he could rule on would be limited. Now, the judge has already ruled that UFC has conducted themselves in a way that has been very anti-competitive against promotions, and their contracts have been too restrictive against fighters. Needless to say, the judge did not grant either of the UFC motions and said that the trial will begin on April 8th, barring no deals between the UFC and the plaintiffs before then. Not only that, but the judge let both parties know that he would most likely add an injunctive relief to any decision that was made, which would mean that if he were to rule against the UFC instead of the UFC getting to negotiate with the plaintiffs for months to even a year to reach a deal while the judge waited for the jury to decide what was going to happen, the judge would make a verdict that could force the UFC to change their business practices immediately. That means if this case actually goes to trial, the UFC would be risking a hell of a lot. The judge is already seeing like he's interested in putting the caps on how long the UFC can have fighters, as far as the lengths of the actual how many fights they have, and how many years that they can have. And to get rid of the sunset clause, which means the UFC could add on more time for certain reasons, like being a champion. Now, the closer we get to that date, definitely make sure you look for settlements. UFC is not going to want to risk their whole business going under here. No, it wouldn't go under, but it would change tremendously. Let's see what's going to happen in the sport next year. We were supposed to be getting a headline co-main event between Bobby Greene versus Dan Hooker, but unfortunately Dan thought just because he could walk through kicks thrown up the side of his damn head, that he could also train and heal from a broken arm at the same time. Unfortunately, there are just some limits that the human bodies can't push past, and he was forced to pull out from the fight just weeks remaining for Bobby Greene to find a replacement. But no worries. In comes Jalin Turner, who says he's more than willing to give it a go against Greene as long as the UFC backs up a truck full of money. And what do you know? The UFC just so happens to have a truck full of money waiting on standby. Turner, who just so happens to be the same man who broke Hooker's arm in the first place, is looking to break a 2-fight skid in which he's been on the wrong side of 2 split decisions. Now listen, the split decision against Gamrot? Questionable. I don't know how we got there. Turner clearly lost the first 2 rounds handily, but it had a bunch of us MMA bros screaming, "But Pride rules! If this was Pride rules, Turner would have won!" Because he almost stopped him in the 3rd round with some beautiful combinations, and Gamrot just didn't know what to do on the feet. Now he'll be facing off against the man who gives Grant Dawson nightmares, Bobby Greene. Greene, who would be on a 3-fight win streak after stopping Dawson's hype with a single punch and beating the artist formerly known as Tony Ferguson. But the UFC refuses to grant him a knockout against Jared Gordon just because his weapon of choice was his head. For my money, if you're walking away while another man's left unconscious, clearly we have a winner. Now I'll do predictions for this fight later, but seeing as Turner is just as exciting and Greene is Greene, it's safe to say that with Hooker out, we're still going to get a real treat of a fight. Every now and again, we get a fighter that we love so much that it's hard to look past the clear signs that something is seriously wrong with them. Now I don't want to sit here and play armchair psychologist, but unfortunately, that's how it's going to come off. Recent videos have shown Tony Ferguson training with influence fitness instructor David Goggins. Now, unfortunately, we have become all too familiar with Tony Ferguson's crazy training habits. And on any other time, we've been able to say, hey, it's just Tony. Tony is just weird. He's interesting. It's because his words have been able to back it up. But more importantly, his performances have shown us that we can just trust Tony being Tony. But it seems we reach a point where Tony's body just is not able to do the things that it used to be able to do. So before, when we had an artist that inspired the phrase, Ferguson's the type of guy who would, now we're just left with a man who is too paranoid to train with any team and whose search to get back to where he was is driving him to do crazier and crazier acts. This is a man whose wife had to get a restraining order against him because she said that he was acting uncharacteristically and having paranoia to the point that he was tearing apart their fireplace in his home and digging out his own leg because he believed doctors had put a tracking chip in it after a reconstructive surgery in his knee. Now, I'm not saying that to make him seem any kind of bad guy. Okay, those are just serious accusations. And unfortunately, his wife did the right thing in making sure that she got him the right help, and it seemed like he got a lot better. And the explanation was that he just hadn't slept for days and had went on a paranoid spree. But unfortunately, Tony's troubles didn't stop right there, because on May 7th, he was arrested for driving under the influence when he crashed his truck into several parked cars along the streets. Now, those charges were reduced, and now he's only going to be serving a year of probation after pleading guilty to reckless driving. But the fact is that he should be facing these consequences as a way to stop him from going further. So far, he's not facing those consequences. And his fight against Paddy Pimblett is a lose-lose situation for Tony. Either he goes out there and he beats Paddy, and then he's got this renewed grandeur that he can go back another title run, or he loses and the UFC may have to put him out. But something tells me that Tony Ferguson isn't the type of guy that's just going to go and enjoy retirement and in peace. Something tells me that Tony Ferguson is going to be the type of guy that's going to keep on trying, and his body's going to pay for it, even when his body's telling him that he needs to stop. Now, file this under miscommunication maybe, but Don Davis came out after the PFL called on Friday and said that Cyborg is going to have 2 fights next year in the PFL. On top of that, he seems like he already has these 2 fights lined up. The first fight is going to get 2-division champion Larissa Pacheco, fresh off her tournament win at featherweight. Now, this is a little shocking to begin with, as I didn't think that they were going to do anything to jeopardize the Cyborg versus Harrison fight, especially after you've had Harrison pretty much on the outs with the company and wanted to look for greener pastures. It seems like they're making her sit out on the show for a year longer in hopes that Cyborg gets past Pacheco. Is just a bad call. But apparently I wasn't the only one that was shocked by this announcement, because Cris Cyborg herself seemed like these came out of left field for her. She says that not only has the PFL not talked to her since they purchased Bellator, but she was the only champion from Bellator that was not invited to the PFL event. She further goes on to say that PFL has bad culture and that she probably wouldn't even like to compete there. This is the last phase of her career, and it's very important that she ends it the way she sees fit. On top of that, the PFL wants to put on a Bellator versus PFL event in either February or March, which Cyborg has already let everyone know that she's fighting in January no matter what in boxing. So how is that going to work that she's going to fight in January and be ready to go in a month, maybe 2 later? Now, Don Davis is that there's no way a fighter can get out of their contract with them from Bellator to PFL. But Cris Cyborg's likely to have the best representative in her quarter. And with the word around the street is that her and Dana White have mended fences not long ago, I'd be very interested to see if Dana might reconsider the UFC's featherweight division just despite the PFL. Things are already getting interesting in PFL's new mission to become the world leader in MMA. Let's see where it goes. ONE FC has big plans for next year. They plan to put on 60 events next year, which is way more than they've ever done. These events are planned to be split between MMA, Muay Thai, and submission grappling. Not only that, but they're planning on going to countries like Qatar, Japan, and the Philippines next year, as well as potentially opening up Europe. All this after spending more time last year developing their Muay Thai and submission grappling scene, while spending less time focusing on MMA. Now, Chatri, the chairman and CEO, says that the reason why they did this was to have their other two businesses run on autopilot. And now that they are running on autopilot, they have a renewed fervor for the MMA business. But that's not what the word on the street says. The word on the street says they're dealing with financial difficulties that could lead to the demise if they can't find new backers. As of 2021, court documents showed that the ONE FC's filing had lost $383 million in total and had laid off 10% of their staff. And at the time, they were only making $5 to $8 million a year on their ONE FC brand. This has led their backers in Qatar feeling embarrassed. So next year, you can either see a banner year for the ONE FC if they can find a backer that continue this momentum, or you can see the end of ONE FC. Now, while I don't think that this is going to be the last year or two of theirs, the writing is pretty much on the wall. This is a company that has spent really big on international names while failing to break into international markets. Even with the deal on Amazon, they're barely getting any viewers, besides the clicks that they get just for having on the front page. So, while we have PFL on the rise, potentially they're also paying too much. Competing with the UFC is pretty expensive. Can anyone do it?
Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe, and let me know your thoughts on this topic below.